A look at part of the world often talked about, but never really explained. War correspondent Hollie McKay takes us to a disputed area of Eastern Europe central to the war between Russia and Ukraine. What should you know about Crimea and why it matters? I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. Holly, why did you want to revisit this area of Crimea? It's a part of Ukraine slash Russia. We'll talk about that in just a moment, that we don't talk about a lot in the news. Why did you want to bring it back up and reinvestigate this part of the world?
I think because we hear so much about Crimea just from a policy point of view, it's this political football going between President Trump, President Zelensky, and then President Putin. But we don't actually hear anything really about what Crimeans want. And I think that tends to be a little bit of a theme in a lot of policy decisions is you have people at the top that are talking about what's best for people on the ground who effectively have very little say or that we don't even hear a lot about in the media. And there's different reasons for that. But I think it's important to look at what Crimeans want. And that's why I kind of wanted to go back into this story a little bit.
Why is Crimea important? When did we first start talking about Crimea in the news coverage of Ukraine and Russia?
Sure. So this is really the beginning of the war that we see now, the war that kind of expanded, if you will, in 2022. That wasn't the start of Russia's invasion into Crimea. This started in the beginning of 2014, and it started with Crimea. That was really the first time, the annexation, and it happened without a bullet being fired. And that was because these little green men just sort of en masse started to go, and they were occupying government buildings. They were occupying the town square. People didn't really know who they were. Putin was denying it, but essentially they were Russian troops just without their insignia. And at the time, Ukrainian troops didn't know what was going on. People were a little bit scared, and they kind of cowered away in their bunkers. And then it really was too late because the Russians had already effectively taken control over the main buildings and the main apparatus. And it was sort of from that point that Ukraine kind of had to withdraw. And that was a sticking point. I think that was Obama was very sort of involved in not wanting to see any fighting with that. But then what you had after that was sort of continues these separatist areas that did explode into violence, and that persisted throughout sort of 8 years until you had the very large-scale invasion in 2022. So Crimea was really the beginning.
Let me go back to the little green men comment, because obviously the only time that I hear little green men in my world right now as a mom of three is referring to aliens.
Yeah.
This sort of descript little green men. But as you were just described to us, these are people that are wearing uniforms. Are they with the government? Are they against the government? They're going into government buildings. They're starting to patrol. It's a very confusing time. But this area of the world, Crimea, which is sort of jetted out into the Black Sea, was it culturally Russian, Holly? Was it culturally Ukrainian? What's its history?
Yeah, so it has a very complex history, and this is why it's not very straightforward where Crimea kind of stands. So historically, it was actually part of the Ottoman Empire, and Russia captured it from the Turks in, I think it was 1783. And then it was transferred to Ukraine in 1954 under Soviet rule. So it wasn't in Russia's hands until then, kind of all being part of the Soviet Union. It then went into Ukrainians' hands in the 50s. Following the Ukrainian independence in 91, with the fall of the Soviet Union, Crimea remained part of Ukraine. And that, I think, never sat well with Putin. And that was always a big point of contention between Moscow and Kyiv. But actually, there was a census, I think it was probably 20 or so years ago now, but at the time, many Crimeans did sort of see themselves not necessarily as pro-Russian nationalists, but very distinctly Crimean. So they weren't, again, sort of like Hawaii. We're not Russia, we're not Ukraine, we're Crimea. They are Russian speakers primarily. So that was a big deciding factor too as to why Putin has always claimed that Crimea should be Russia. After the takeover, there was a referendum, which the international community largely saw as a sham referendum, where basically more than 90% of the population voted to be part of Russia. So Russia sort of took that as its invitation, if you will, to publicly then sort of come out and claim Crimea at that point, whereas before they were kind of denying involvement in this annexation. So Ukraine sort of had always dismissed that. The US, of course, never recognized that referendum either. But there is a semblance of murky truth to that. Again, I can't speak to how legitimate the referendum is, other than it being denounced by the international community. But I think a majority of people there had come from Russia, and that has increased because, especially since the annexation, you've seen a little bit of a population or demographic change where suddenly, the people that were pro-Ukraine or identified maybe more on the Ukrainian side have left Crimea, and you have much more of the Russian population that are like, oh, we're now free to go and live there and move there. So you've seen a much bigger population from Russia's mainland now moving to Crimea. And an interesting part of it is the Tatars. They're actually the indigenous people of Crimea. They're usually Turkish speaking. Again, they come from that Ottoman Empire lineage. Many of them have actually joined Ukrainian fighting forces because they are quite anti-Russia and have been very much opposed to the annexation. So that's also a bit of an interesting history as to why they support Ukraine. And that was really because under the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, they were actually forcibly deported. So he deported them in 1944 under very false accusations of Nazi collaboration. This led to many, many deaths of the Tatar population. They had decades in exile, and it really wasn't until the 80s, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, that many of the indigenous people, the Crimean Tatars, were then able to move back. So as you can imagine, they're very much against the Russian occupation. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit.
That's and also just to connect the dots there, that claim of Nazism being part of Ukraine is part of the battle cry for Vladimir Putin even today. It's very helpful because it brings us beyond just our current news cycle. So Russia comes in, effectively says, this is actually ours. We're going to take this piece of land. There's not and I want to be careful about, speaking of murky, I want to be careful about phrasing this. Although there are those that spoke out against this taking place around the world, it still happened. So Russia still went in there, takes this piece of land, says it's theirs. And now this is part of a bigger picture, which is there are different areas of Ukraine that Russia says is actually belongs to Russia. And when we're talking about peace negotiations, ceasefire negotiations, these areas of land continue to come up as, could this be an opening for negotiations where there could be an agreement that some of this land officially becomes part of Russia again or stays in Ukrainian hands. You were there, though, in a very interesting time. So Russia annexes Crimea 2014. We could look at that at the beginning of this conflict that we're currently in. You were there in 2017, Hollie.
Yeah.
What was it like to be there? What did you see?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. Obviously, I'm there in the winter. I think it was January, so it's very cold. But a beautiful sort of space. It was interesting because a lot of the people that I connected with, many of who were very pro-Ukrainian in the beginning and were very much against the annexation, had actually at that point, almost 3 years in, had shifted their allegiance to Russia. And that was because after the referendum that took place in 2014, Kiev really made, in my view, a mistake when it comes to policy, and it deemed the Crimeans as traitors and basically, cut them off from banking systems, cut them off from getting their passports, their documents, made life really just challenging. And I remember one of the women I was speaking to said, she went to Kiev to try to get her documents, to renew her passport, and she was just cold-shouldered. She was basically told she couldn't, just absolutely treated like garbage. And she said, meanwhile, this country that I'd never been to in my life, Russia, was willing to, lay it all out. Here's your documents, here's your passport, here's all the things that you need. So she sort of felt that she had no choice but to kind of move to that side, even though that was not at all what she'd wanted in the beginning. And I have heard so many remnants of that too in these other occupied areas, in these separatist areas like the Donbass and Luhansk, that Kiev is kind of taking that same approach of isolating people that are living there and sort of deeming them as the against them, and that is actually just having the opposite effect and turning people that are pro-Ukrainian to becoming pro-Russia. So that is very, that sentiment was quite strong. Something else I saw interesting, which still very much persists today, which at that point I'd never really heard of. So after Russia annexed Crimea, a lot of the international community, including Obama at the time, implemented very heavy sanctions on Russia for that move, which are in place today and have obviously only increased with the war. But there was sort of a very strong community and contingency in Crimea that were what they called pro-sanction. I was like, what is this? Pro-sanction? How can this be a good thing? But there's a strong contingency of people who believe it's a good thing because it forces local communities to work together. It forces people to make and create things that they may have otherwise not, because they were reliant on something coming from overseas that they can no longer access. So there was a group that really said, this is cheaper, this is better, this is supporting the locals. For example, if you can no longer get French cheese, you're going to, turn to how can you make these artisan cheeses on your own? So that was a really big thing that I was surprised to learn about, was this kind of pro-sanction community that saw the sort of shutdown of the outside influences as a positive.
So that was 3 years after this happens. Now let's fast forward to modern times. You're going back and trying to look at the sources that you have been able to cultivate in Crimea. What are they telling you now? What are you learning about what's happening on the ground in Crimea and how it figures into this bigger conversation about, can there be a negotiated peace?
Well, and I guess the challenge is those who aren't pro-Ukrainian are very hesitant even then, but certainly much more hesitant now to speak out. You basically, any sort of semblance of maybe free speech that existed doesn't anymore. And you see that in Russia. People often ask, well, why aren't we hearing from Russians? Well, it's because they don't have freedom of speech. It's not safe for them to speak out. So it is much harder to even get people to be able to express maybe how they feel. And a lot of people, even in exile, it can still be a risk if you have family members in any Russian territory. So Crimea is very much part of that equation now. When Russia came in, they did shut down a lot of the press. So it's really not a free place that you can go around and condemn the government freely. So it is much harder to reach people. It's much harder to, I think, track what their real feelings are to it. There's certainly a huge downside in the sense that Crimea was it was like the breadbasket of Ukraine. It's where everybody wanted to go for the holidays. It's beautiful. It's set out on the Baltic Sea. And that whole tourism is just that's burst. Nobody except for maybe, Russians are kind of going there. But essentially, from what I'm hearing, Crimea is really just this big military base now, which of course it always was had a military presence. It's your sort of thoroughfare into the Black Sea, into Russia, into Europe, sort of into the rest of the world. It's a very strategic gateway, but that's all it is now. It's not the beautiful, thriving, incredible place that everybody wanted to go and visit before. It's a very much an industrial military peninsula.
So why don't you think Ukraine isn't more willing to say, you know what, if this gets us closer to peace or a ceasefire, and there are those that were already in Crimea that culturally aligned with Russia, why would it? And I know we just spoke to a Ukrainian lawmaker. I know this would be incredibly difficult in the United States if we were like, you know what, we'll just give part of this just so that we could have peace. But why is there resistance to that? Is this a place that is up for negotiation that could be the key to peace?
I don't think that President Zelensky could ever publicly concede Ukraine. I think recent polling in Ukraine shows that many Ukrainians sort of accept the land, that it must, it's probably going to be ceded to end the war. Although there is the fear that would make it impossible to reclaim it in the future. So I think it is a big obstacle. As one a friend of mine who was an advisor to Zelensky said to me, look, it's quite simple. He said he doesn't see how it's possible to reclaim it militarily at this point. He said that it's probably something that should have been addressed much earlier in the war, but he said, as it stands, Russia will likely continue to control it de facto. But in terms of formal recognition, Ukraine will never accept Russia's claim. He said that that's unconstitutional and illegal, and any Ukrainian politician who suggests otherwise would essentially be signing themselves up to go to jail, is the words that he used. So he said things, the best way to move forward with peace is accepting things as they are. So, okay, Russia is the de facto controller of Crimea, but don't expect Ukraine to formally recognize that.
What do Crimeans want?
And that is the mix. So I think in many ways there is obviously a pro-Russia contingency, a much quieter, but I'm sure still very much exists, pro-Ukraine who doesn't want war, who hates what happened, but they don't have the luxury of speaking out. And then you have people that sort of said to me and continue to say, there is too much emotion tied to this. We're exhausted. We can't go from one country to another country, back to another country. Let's give it 20 years and we can do a referendum again and see where we're at.
That's interesting. And it's an important thing to remember, just the length of time that many of these people have, a large swath of their life has been spent in war or under wartime conditions. And the exhaustion with that has to be recognized as we're talking about this at a very high policy level. Hollie, thank you so much. It's always great to have your perspective on this part of the world, and certainly a developing story and a part of the world that we'll continue to watch. Thank you.
Anytime.